to the cloud. And our rotation is going to be, we're going to do Song of Songs tonight, and then I'll do my best to do the Torah portion with the Tuesday class. And what I had in mind for the Tuesday class is possibly, rather than just taking a topic like we normally do and trying to unpack it from the Torah portion, what really helped me this year was just going step by step through the Yom Kippur service. I've read through it year after year after year, and it just never really dawned on me how much effort, work, coordination, preparation had to go into this one day. And so I just systematically read through, like, okay, if I were the high priest, what would my day look like? And I actually had to back up to the day before because they didn't let him go to sleep all night. So I thought it might be just useful, rather than do something deep and wide and so forth, just put ourselves in the steps of the high priest and his preparation and just kind of walk through his day with him to kind of, you know, how you do on if you get like Google Maps or something, it'll actually take you down to the street view rather than the drone view. And I thought this year that might be a nice change up. Let's do the street view of Yom Kippur. And I think it'll give us a better appreciation for how much detail, how many details had to be 100% correct. And it's so difficult to get any detail 100% correct today. You've seen my PowerPoint slides, right? So, and you've seen me do math. We know how hard it is to get details right. But this is a procedure that had to be right. It had to be 100%. And I think it'll give us a great appreciation for the work of the priesthood in the temple times. It's, I know Rico does a lot of work with Joe Good, trying to unpack the temple services and so forth. And I appreciate that work because so many times, 2,000 years removed, we really don't appreciate what all was involved in it. And therefore we have a very casual attitude toward this temple service. And, you know, it comes up every now and then, and I'm way off topic, by the way. When you talk to people about using a prayer book or a siddur, and typically if they don't have any background with a siddur at all, it's very intimidating to a non-Jew because it looks to them, maybe at first glance, suspiciously Catholic, very systematic, very ritualistic, very repetitious. There doesn't seem to be much flexibility in it, which there actually is. Once you learn a little bit more about it, there's actually a huge amount of flexibility if you pray out of a siddur. But often we don't appreciate how much of the temple service needed to be migrated to a place where it could still be guarded and remembered. Because very little of our history has been in a time when there actually was a functioning temple, right? So we've got a lot of, especially Leviticus, we've got a lot of instructions that for most generations have had very little practical application. Nevertheless, we're still commanded to guard and remember the commandments. So how do we internalize something that's 2,000 years ago in many cultures away, many cultures removed from our generation? And sometimes as you read through a siddur, it's an opportunity to step back in time and see how much of that service they tried to migrate into the prayer book. And then you get an appreciation for why it has verses about the incense service, why it has verses about the sacrificial service, why some of the individual prayers are in that prayer book, because it's a preservation. It's not exactly a freezing of time, but it's a preservation of a time that we have no familiarity with. And so I invite you, as you feel comfortable, if you've never looked at a Jewish prayer book before, Don't get the Hebrew version right off the bat if you can't read it. That'll make it even more intimidating. But it's like, just glance through it. And it will be intimidating at first, but then maybe after tomorrow's class, is if we walk with the high priest through the service, we'll appreciate much more what an average person like us had to go through just to go and to bring a sacrifice or to be present in the temple when there were services going on, much less be the high priest and know all the rituals that he had to know. Because today we tend to be very anti-ritual. It reeks of something we feel like we should have grown out of. But, there are things we do need to grow out of if they're not needful things, if they're not serving in their function of leading you into the word. But look how much of the average person's worship during temple times was very ritualistic. It was done the same way over and over, day after day, week after week, year after year, right? Shemitah after Shemitah, Jubilee after Jubilee. It was just done the same way, time after time. And if we can accept that and say, well, yeah, that's true, then I think we're much less intimidated by maybe aspects of our own worship that to an outsider might appear to be ritualistic, but they're not ritualistic at all. That's not the background of it. Not in the sense that these rituals were not intended to change your life, if that makes sense. And I wanted to throw that in there before we get started, because once we work through, really the one thing I want to say about this passage in Song of Songs, which is to finish what we did last week, where we talked about Isaac as being this atoning sacrifice. I want to finish that thought, because if you thought it was pretty incredible last week, what's coming out of the rabbinic tradition about one person atoning for the nation, it's going to get even more intense. We just stopped in the middle last week. We didn't finish. So I want to finish that. And then I just want to take some passages out of the Midrash on the Song of Songs on what makes us beautiful. You are beautiful, my love, is what we're going to read. Your eyes are like dove's eyes. And so the Midrash will go on and it will delineate the many ways in which the Father finds us beautiful. And there's going to be a couple of slides in there that, it's, I don't think there's kids watching anyway, but there's a story behind the slide. And one of the beauties is how beautiful we are when we pray. We don't tend to see ourselves because we're not looking at ourselves when we pray, but think of how the Father sees you as you are praying, whether it's formally standing there with a prayer book, whether it's stuck in traffic and saying, I'm not going to lose this time. I'm going to pray while I'm sitting here in traffic rather than get annoyed, or sitting in the parking lot with the dog. He sees those opportunities that we take to be with him. And from his point of view, it's a beautiful time. For us, often we're rushed, we're hurried, or we feel like we're not adequately prepared for prayer. But it's just an opportunity to maybe see ourselves through his eyes when we do approach in prayer. Is there a standard Siddur? No. There's gobs of Siddurs. And I mean that. There's gobs of them. The one that I like to use for just day to day, it's this little thing I got from Art Scroll, primarily because it had large print. And this one's all in Hebrew. So if you need the English, this wouldn't be the one. This one This is the Complete Art Scroll Siddur, and this version is the Sephardic. If let me type that in there, where you can find the website. Don't be surprised again if you are intimidated when you look at the inside, but that's okay. I've had this for a long time, and there's still sections of this that I find intimidating. But I always find that I can learn something from it. The information I found to write the book on the 7 shepherds and the 8th prince, I found it right in here, right there in the liturgy that's prayed every year about the 7 shepherds and the 8th prince and how they're going to destroy the red one. It's like, ding. I mean, it's not hidden. It's in plain sight if you're not scared to look inside. And I can't give you the specific link to this one, but if you just look up complete, that would have been a bad word. My typing isn't great today. It doesn't like Sephardic either. That's the name of this one, but it'll pull up, like I say, Gobs, and this is just one publisher. There's Feldheim, there's Geffen House, there's several Jewish publishers that are all going to have some little bit different, layout and so forth. What I would advise, if you don't want to spend a bunch of money, if you have a used bookstore like McKay's, and I don't know if it's all over the United States or just in the South. I know Knoxville has a McKay's. I think Atlanta might. There's some places in the South that have them, but they're a huge used bookstore chain. I got a Rosh Hashanah prayer book for a couple of bucks because I was actually using it for research. I already had a different one that we use in our congregation. And I just wanted to do research on Rosh Hashanah. And for a couple of bucks, it was somebody had sold off a bunch of prayer books out of a synagogue somewhere. And so it was a former synagogue copy. But you can find those on online bookstores, used bookstores, and you don't have to spend a bunch of money if you're just exploring. Because you might want to explore several till you find one that you feel comfortable using. And you're liable to get hooked on it, the daily prayers at least, because it provides such a structure for your day. Whether you do the morning prayers, the afternoon prayers, the evening prayers. When I was working, I liked the afternoon prayers because of the shift that I worked evening watch. So it was like my morning prayers because I didn't go to work till noon. But now that I'm retired, I'm liking the morning prayer, as like the one that I'm not going to miss. I like that one better because it now fits my schedule better. And by afternoon, I'm usually got my nose so deep in a book. It's hard to come out and think like a human being, to go too deep sometimes in our heads. So let's just get on into the share screen. And what I have here is what we really needed to do first is to review slides 9 through 20. And my problem is I can't see which slides those are. We'll guess. Right here. I think that's it. Because what I want to talk about tonight has to do with the cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of En-Gedi. And so as a review from last week, they see Becharmeh in the vineyards as an allusion to the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, because they are seen as the vineyard that was planted. And of course, that vineyard became Israel And so the description in this particular verse, verse 14, is that the beloved is a cluster of henna blossoms in the vineyards of En-Gedi. And there was more that I could actually have done on En-Gedi, but I felt like following that thread was more important. But it says a heavy cluster, such as grapes, is typically placed upon wooden poles to which it is tied. Similarly, and this is coming from the rabbinic tradition now. This is not coming from, us in 2021 trying to tie Messiah into the Torah. No, this is coming out of the rabbinic tradition. This is the rabbinic tradition bringing the Messiah to us, in a sense. It says, similarly, as described in Genesis 22:9, Isaac was bound and placed upon wood on top of the altar. So they're drawing a link between the cluster that's typically placed upon wooden poles and tied there to Isaac. And they see his binding and being placed upon the wood on the altar as thematically linked to the cluster on the wooden poles. So let's say a Jewish person is reading this passage and they read this heavy about the cluster. My beloved is a cluster. Well, they don't just see it like in the plain text, the cluster of henna, which we've already tied to the bride and the redemption price. And I think we did it again last week. But the cluster has a specific connotation. And that specific connotation is derived from the Torah itself. If you remember Eshkol, because of the cluster of grapes that they cut down there, I want to look at that a little bit more. Because simply, this is the tradition that surrounds this particular verse. And so when Yeshua comes onto the scene in the first century, would at least some people have associated him with this cluster? Would they have associated him with Isaac being bound and placed upon the altar? And like I said, incredibly, we don't expect to read something like this in the Midrash, because in Orthodox Judaism, there is such a strong rejection of the idea that one person could be sacrificed for the sin of many. And much of it's just pushback against Christianity and the methods that Christianity used to push the Christian faith upon Jews. And so you can see often with both ends, with both Christians and Jews, I think some of the way that they formulate their dogmas and so forth, it's simply pushback against the other group. And that's fine. We get it now. We have hindsight. We see that. But see, we can separate out all of the anger, the emotion, and kind of like, let's just look at what they're saying and say, maybe they're saying the same thing and don't realize it because, the history, enough said there. But the Midrash, it does. It goes on to detail how Isaac's atoning sacrifice prepared him to be able to leap to the defense of Israel and to become their advocate before the Holy One when they sin. So last week I used 1 John 2:1-2 as an example coming from the apostolic scriptures, where John is saying, my little children, I'm writing these things to you so that you may not sin. And if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, Yeshua HaMashiach, the righteous. And he himself is the propitiation for our sins, and not for ours only, but also for the sins of the whole world. And so if we take that verse and we match it against what the Midrash is saying, and this is incredible. It's like a sample passage of how the conversation goes, how this Isaac is seen as becoming the advocate for Israel. And so it says in this speculation, it says in the future, when God will tell the patriarchs, your children have sinned against me. And see, John even uses that phrase, children, little children. Isaac will mount a spirited and detailed defense. Are they my children and not your children? And how much could they have sinned? A man lives 70 years and heaven doesn't punish him during his first 20. Of the remaining 50, half are nights when a person is asleep and does not sin. Of the remaining 25, half are spent praying or eating, attending to bodily needs. So really, you only have 12 and a half years left to get into too much trouble. And so Isaac says, if you will bear those sins, fine. And if not, I will bear half and you half. And if you wish me to bear them all, then I've already sacrificed myself before you at the Akedah, at the binding of Isaac, when he's offered on Mount Moriah. And it says God will accept Isaac's defense. So this tradition is giving us a background that Isaac is an advocate for Israel when they have sinned. And this goes back again to the cluster, the commentary on the cluster, this beloved who is born on poles, like a cluster of grapes. And in summary, I don't want to talk about El Shaddai again, but remember, in the summary, it says, who is able to say to the attribute of strict justice or judgment, enough? And the summary is, it's Isaac. Isaac is the type of Messiah. He's the one who is able to be that advocate and say, okay, yes, justice, judgment, this is what mankind deserves. But there's a place where he steps in and he says, enough. He will be the advocate. He will bear the sin. Let's see. So it goes back to the verse we were working with. My beloved is to me a cluster of henna blossoms. And we know from ancient times, henna was used to decorate the bride before her wedding. But what was so interesting is that the kofar, which you can translate it out as henna or pitch, it's, where is it? There it is, kofar. It's what's used to cover the ark. It's a protection. It's like a redemption price, which is what, kafar is. It's a redemption price. And that's exactly what Strong's 3722 is going to tell us. It can be a henna plant as used for dyeing, or it can be a redemption price, a ransom. So in Noah's Ark, we kind of see that family was hennaed. They were ransomed from destruction with this person who is able to ransom them. Again, that Spirit of God that's moving over the surface of the waters in Genesis 1:1, that's understood in rabbinic tradition to be the Mashiach that's moving over the surface of the waters. You see the surface of the waters responding in the time of Noah, but you also see Noah and his family being redeemed from the tragedy. And then in the Gospels, you get these stories about Yeshua walking on the water and commanding the sea and the wind, the same way that he could have commanded the sea and the wind to quit raging in order to preserve Noah. In fact, if you read in the Hebrew Matthew, one of the commands in the sea when they're out on the Sea of Galilee, he uses the command nach, which means rest. And Noah's name is spelled the same way. It's like he's saying, Noah, nach, rest. It's a prophecy, and you see it gets to the disciples because they kind of suspect, there's a connection between these two things. So with that said, let's just finish out their thoughts here. They say that the days of creation are thought to correspond to the millennia of the earth. The first 2 days were without form and void. They were just watery, dark, deep days. And so they call these first 2,000 years of creation, based on the first 2 days of creation, they call these the days of void. And they say that if we look at those first 2,000 years, there was just not that much work of faith that went on. I mean, out of all mankind, it was one family in the flood. There was just so little that was lasting or that endured. Even Enoch, like he walked with God and then he was not. It's just like he took him. So there's very little lasting work, spiritual work, faith work that endures from those first 2 millennia. But then comes Abraham. And they say Abraham is where everything turns. And so for the millennia 3 and 4, these are the days of the Torah, they call it. And this was ushered in, they say, by Abraham, and that his work of faith was so magnificent in the earth that it established the next 2 millennia, which are called the days of the Torah. So that's 4,000 down. And then we would have the last 2,000 years. And that puts us in the days of Messiah, by the way. But Abraham had some concerns about the promises concerning his descendants. And you've all read this verse. He says, "Fear not, Abraham, I'm your shield. I'm your very great reward." In other words, they said that Abraham had some concern about would his work endure. If he looks in the past and he sees the failings of the first 2,000 years of creation, and he has these great promises of descendants and so forth, and he's thinking, oh my goodness, well, how can this work ever endure? If the first 2,000 went so badly, then who's to say my descendants will be any better? And he's told, "Fear not, Abraham, I'm your shield. I'm your very great reward." And this is where I said it gets even weirder than it's already gotten in terms of saying that there could be a man, that there could be an individual who could redeem the world. So just summarizing what the Midrash says, that's what I've done here. It goes on and it describes a man who will redeem the world in the days of Messiah, the last 2 millennia, using the creation week as the example. So you've got the first 2,000, nothing much lasting happens. You've got the days of Torah, when Abraham's influence comes into the world. And if I'm not mistaken, Yeshua even makes a reference to this. I don't know the chapter and verse where he talks about the Torah and the prophets until John or something. But this was the concern of Abraham. When my days are over, what will happen? And he's assured that this shield and this reward will be a person. It will be a man who will redeem the world in the days of Messiah in these last 2 millennia, which we would say is the last 2,000 years from the time of Messiah, Yeshua, until this present day. And so it says, when Abraham's children commit sins, this great man will arise among them like Isaac. That's why we've had all this conversation about Isaac being the cluster. And this man will say to judgment like Isaac, enough. And it's said that the Holy One will take him from the world and will seize him as a pledge on Israel's behalf. This should sound real familiar to us. We take it for granted because we see it in hindsight. Imagine in the first century where they're just entering into the days of Messiah, how they couldn't take it for granted because they wouldn't have had hindsight to look at to say, oh yeah, we know who this guy is that they're talking about. We couldn't say that at all. I mean, we would have to be so on point with our faith. And so the Midrash says this man is Eshkol, which is a cluster of grapes. Typically, it's a cluster. He's a man who has knowledge of everything inside him. They call him Esh Shehakol, a man who has everything. And they say that this everything that is inside of him, he knows all of the scripture. He knows all of the oral law. He knows all of the Agadah. You can see a lot of this when Yeshua tells parables. He told a lot of parables. Agadah is going to be, the stories are part of the teaching method. And they say that this man has everything in him. And you say, well, Yeshua did all that because even at the age of 12, he's sitting at the temple, not just discussing scripture, but he's going back and forth. He's talking about the applications, what we would call the oral law. He teaches with parables. He teaches through Agadah. He has everything inside of him. And so HaKofer, the cluster, they say, is this man who atones for Israel's sins. He's Eshkol. He's the man who has everything. He's HaKofer. He's the cluster of henna, the cluster of grapes. Because remember, what does the henna do? It protects. It was put on the ark. It's applied to the bride. So, and I just went ahead and took verbatim this passage concerning Eshkol or HaKofer, the cluster. It says, I will take the above described individual from the world and seize him as a pledge on their behalf. This is an allusion to the Holy One. Blessed is he, a man in whom everything is. And man there is in quotes, interior quotes, if you're just listening by audio. And so it says the atonement for the nation generated by the death of a single worthy individual takes place in the merit of Israel. Now in the Midrash, it would have said Jews, but they're using that as an all-inclusive term for Israel by that point. So think of what they're saying right here. They're not just talking about a human being. Within the Midrash, they say this is an allusion to the Holy One. Blessed is he, a man in whom everything is. Now, I'm not telling you I understand the mystery of Messiah as it relates to the Father. And like I say, sometimes I worry about people who think they do. But I'm telling you right here, they recognize that this particular individual in whose merit he's going to he's going to atone for Israel's sins through this man. There's something about this man that says he's an allusion to the Holy One because he is the man in whom is everything. And we know that sometimes, like he'll say, Adonai, he's a man of war. We know he's not a literal man. He's a spirit being. But nevertheless, we see this connection here in the Midrash, which to me, this is incredible. It's simply incredible. Especially if you're familiar with some of the anti-missionary material. And I get a lot of their objections because often, again, the miscommunication is old. And often things on both sides are just pushed back. But sometimes you're actually talking about the same thing. If you just drop all the emotion and who's right and wrong, you'll find out that there's actually a place of agreement here. So to me, this is the most incredible place of agreement that I think I've ever found about the person of Messiah Yeshua. And recognizing that this man, in whom is everything, that he could atone for the sins of Israel. And of course, in the letter from John, he extended that all the way to the whole world, that he is capable of taking away the sin of the world. So here's the reference, Numbers 13:23 through 24. And remember, this is the 12 spies. We know that 10 of them are going to bring an evil report, and 2 of them are going to bring a good report. And there is something about their report that seems to be derived from this particular passage. Now, they mention other things, but it's not like they take a sample giant back to Moses and say, oh, look how big they are. Look at this giant. They don't do that. Instead, they cut a cluster of grapes. So it says they came to the valley of Eshcol, and from there cut down a branch with a single cluster of grapes. Okay, so we're thinking, okay, the grapes were so huge they could only do one cluster on the pole. True. In a literal way, true. Just a single cluster on the pole because they were so big. But what if the cluster really is Yeshua? What if the cluster really is this Messiah that they're talking about, who's going to take away the sin of the nation? Then there's something deeper going on here. There's something bigger than a big bunch of grapes. There's a person being associated with this action. Now, what they knew at the time, we don't know. But it says they carried it on a pole between 2 men. This is exactly how the Midrash is describing carrying the cluster of grapes. They carried it on a pole between 2 men with some of the pomegranates and the figs. That place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster which the sons of Israel cut down from there. Now, that last sentence to me just popped when I read it. Anytime you see the text clarifying itself when you're not sure it needs to, I mean, I can accept that, oh, those are the biggest grapes we've ever seen. Let's cut down a bunch and take it back and show them. That much I get. But we already know, because the text already told us it was the Valley of Eshcol. And it's already told us they cut down a cluster. But now it takes the time out to restate. So in case we're missing that this is important, it says that place was called the Valley of Eshcol because of the cluster, which the sons of Israel cut down from there. There was prophecy embedded in this. This is what that's telling us. Who does Jewish tradition tell us the cluster is? Well, they don't name Messiah Yeshua because it's what we're reading probably predated Messiah Yeshua. But I'm going to show you, if it did predate Messiah Yeshua, there were still some people who were aware of this midrashic interpretation. They cut down the cluster. So when they cut down the cluster, what do? Well, 2 of the spies see this as a good thing. Joshua and Caleb, they see this as a great thing. But 10 of the spies, they bring it in support of their evil report. They cut down the cluster. If this is a human being, it's another way of saying they killed him. They cut him down. So let's go to John 11:42 through 43. And this, remember, we talked about was Bethany in Bethany, just prior to Pesach. And Yeshua goes there and he's going to resurrect Lazarus. Remember, we talked about how if Nadav and Avihu hadn't been taken away, then Elazar couldn't come. The helper couldn't come. The comforter couldn't come. And so here we've got a guy with the same name. And it'll say Lazarus, but we know it's Elazar in Hebrew. And so Yeshua's praying to the Father. And remember, this man that they're talking about in the Midrash, they say he's identified with the Holy One himself, a man in whom is everything. So Yeshua's praying. He says, I knew that you always hear me, but because of the people standing around, I said it, so that they may believe that you sent me. Okay, remember the Midrash is telling us this person's going to come after the days of Torah are over. Those 2,000 years of Torah over, the days of Messiah are going to come. And he said, I want them to believe that you sent me. When he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, Elazar, come forth. The man who had died came forth, bound hand and foot with wrappings, and his face was wrapped around with a cloth. All right, so Yeshua is giving them a preview of what's about to happen to him. He is about to come forth from the dead. They will have bound him hand and foot. They would have wrapped him, and he's going to come forth. Yeshua said to them, unbind him and let him go. Therefore, many of the Jews who came to Miriam and saw what he had done believed in him. But remember, we have 12 spies. 2 of them say this is a great thing. 10 of them, they cut it down, they cut down the cluster, and then they use it as evidence of their evil report. It says some of them went to the Pharisees and told them the things which Yeshua had done. All right, now we're reading the next sentence, but I want you to pause right there just so you have the background of what's about to be said. It says, therefore the chief priests, and right here we're probably talking about mostly Sadducees. We're talking about a lot of political appointees, people who paid for the positions, and apparently some of the Pharisees. Now we know that Pharisees believed in the resurrection of the dead, so it makes me wonder which Pharisees they rounded up for this particular council, which actually was not convened according to the rules of the Pharisees themselves. It sounds like they were possibly tied in with the school of Shammai. At any rate, we won't unpack that tonight. Therefore, the chief priests and the Pharisees convened a council and were saying, what are we doing? For this man is performing many signs. If we let him go on like this, all men will believe in him, and the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Well, incidentally, that's exactly what happened. But one of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all, nor do you take into account that it is expedient for you that one man die for the people, and that the whole nation not perish. This is exactly what our Midrash is telling us, that the Holy One is going to take that man in exchange for the nation. He says that the whole nation not perish. Now, he did not say this on his own initiative, but being high priest that year, he prophesied that Yeshua was going to die for the nation, and not for the nation only, but in order that he might also gather together into one the children of God who were scattered abroad. And from that day on, they planned together to kill him. From that day on, we see that they planned to cut the cluster and to put him on the poles to atone for the sins of the nation. But just like John extended it into the whole world as well, Caiaphas' words also extend it. See, he backing up, he says, if we let him go on like this, the Midrash says it's for the sons of Israel. And then it kind of stops there. But they go on and they say, hey, all men will believe in him. And then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation. Well, this is exactly what happens. They become inclusive. They bring the Romans And they talk about all men. So they're bringing into this midrashic expectation of prophecy as it concerns the wake up, babe, as it concerns the cluster of Eshkol, as it concerns the advocacy of this man like Isaac, this man who has everything. They also extend it. It's not that John just dreamed this up and extended it out into the world. It actually seems to come out of the mouth of Caiaphas, not because he wanted it to, but because he was high priest and he prophesied anyway. That it's going to go beyond Yeshua dying for the nation, but everybody's going to start believing in him. And that this man, his work will not be limited to simply atoning for the sins of Israel, but he might be able to also gather in the children of God who were scattered abroad. That's exactly the way that John put it. Little children, little children. And so from that day on, they planned together to kill him. I don't have any confidence at all that the people who are involved in this conspiracy know exactly what they're doing. I don't know that they understand the why. I don't know that they understand the words coming out of their mouths. Nevertheless, they're acting upon this ancient prophecy, at least according to the Jewish expectation of how it would play out. And then they say it's even beyond that. It's even beyond the nation of Israel. He's going to atone for the sins of the whole world. So, HaKofer, or the henna blossoms of the beloved, they say in the Midrash that this is like a play on word. You can translate it out shekafar, which would translate as that which God has denied. That which God has denied. And as you read the details to that, how they're looking at kafar, because remember, looking at the cluster of henna blossoms, one comment to it said that this alludes to the acceptance of the atonement from the lineage of Israel, that is, the lineage of Abraham. Because remember, he was assured, fear not, Abraham. I am your shield. I'm your very great reward. When your 2,000 years is up, when your 2 days is up, then I'm going to bring in the days of Messiah, and he will be descended from you just as I promised. And the rabbis comment that this play on word is just a way of the Father saying that the lineage of Messiah will come from the children of Abraham. He will not come from the nations of the world. And so this may be exactly what Abraham was promised, a shield, a reward in the days of Mashiach that would establish the work that he did, the days of Torah. That the days of Mashiach would come and they would establish that work, that he didn't have to be afraid that it would just disappear, that there would be so little left of it like there was from the first 2,000 years of creation. So those children, those little children, Abraham's descendants, would be prepared in the days of Mashiach for the 7th millennium, which is known as Yom Shekalo Shabbat, or the day that is all Shabbat. And like I said last week, a little baby boy, he has to absorb the holiness of one Shabbat before his circumcision on the 8th day. And so the message here, because now we're looking at these 7 millennia, it's saying that Israel, those who are being saved, those who are being redeemed, those who are being ransomed, that they will go through the holiness of a 7th millennium before the 8th, when an additional veil is taken away, when they get an additional type of circumcision, when they will be elevated to another level of holiness, where they can actually be that proper sacrifice that the sacrifice must be. You're not bringing sacrifices that don't represent you, you're bringing sacrifices that do represent you. So if you become that sacrifice as you go in, you want to be that acceptable sacrifice. And so by living through this 7th millennium, this Yom Shakalos Shabbat that was prepared by the days of Messiah, and now Messiah will reign, we will have the opportunity to absorb an entire 1,000 years of holiness in the 7th millennium before we pass into the 8th. So, somebody is snoring. Wake up. Okay. Now let's go on to verse 15, Song of Songs 115. It says, how beautiful you are, my darling. How beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves. And just a real simple comment there. It says, each source of beauty is thought to be a mitzvah. When we are beautiful, it's because we are being obedient to our Creator. When we are living according to His will and the way that He created us to be and the way that He created us to serve Him. And so from there, it goes into this long list of mitzvot, of commandments with which Israel beautifies herself for her bridegroom. And so you have to see it the way that it's kind of written as the bridegroom is looking at Israel, saying, how beautiful you are, my darling, how beautiful you are. Your eyes are like doves. We've talked about before how it's thought that the dove, when Noah turned her loose that second time, that she actually penetrated into the Garden of Eden, and that the olive leaf that she brought back was literally from the Garden of Eden. And we'll get back into that again later, but for tonight, just to kind of wrap up, I thought this was just one of the most beautiful passages that I had read. Because if putting on His commandments, it's like we're putting on His clothes, His garments that He is sending us. And as we beautify ourselves with these garments and these spices and all these wonderful instructions that He has given us, and each one beautifies us more. It doesn't make us more of a bride. I don't know that it does that, but it definitely makes us a more beautiful and desirable bride. And so it starts working through this list. It says, you are beautiful in acts of kindness. And by the way, if you're listening by audio, this is mostly visual. So it's not going to make much sense. It's kind of embedded into the pictures, the visuals on this. But what is the beauty of the dove? You are beautiful in acts of kindness. And it says, if anyone who engages in Torah study does not perform acts of kindness, he is like one who has no God. If one who observes the Torah is not kind, then there is no fulfillment of any mitzvah that could make him beautiful. So they see the kindness of the Father kind of goes back to the 2 greatest commandments. It's not just about loving the Father with all your heart, soul, and strength, but loving your neighbor as yourself. And if you're not able to do those acts of kindness for your neighbor, it says you are like one who has no God, and there is no commandment that you could keep that would ever make you beautiful if you're not kind, because they say this is the heart of the Torah. This is the heart of Leviticus. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. It says you are beautiful in the commandments of the household. So think of all the commandments associated with your household. The laws of Nidah, the laws of separating the dough, the kosher eating, everything that would pertain to your household, honoring parents. That when you keep those commandments of a household, You're beautiful. It says you are beautiful in the commandments of the field. And the field is the world. Yeshua taught us that. And so the rabbi said, even in exile, in the field of the world, Israel beautifies herself with the commandments she acquires working there. Even without living in the nation of Israel, even without a temple, even without a functioning priesthood, Israel, you are beautiful because you were in the field and you were still beautifying yourself with the commandments. That's a wheat field up in the Galilee. It says you were beautiful in Kilayim. And Kilayim is when you're shopping for a garment, you actually read the label and you find out if there might be wool or cotton mixed into the same fabric. And if you choose your garments in respect of that particular commandment, it says you're beautiful. It says you are beautiful when you're wrapped in tzitzit. You are beautiful when you plant. And beautiful when you plant, it says, refers to observing the laws such as when you plant a tree, that for 3 years you count the tree as uncircumcised. You don't benefit from its fruit. And then in the 4th year, it's holy to Adonai. You would have to take it to Jerusalem. But then in the 5th year, you may eat of its fruit. And so as a kind of a corollary to that, they say you are beautiful in circumcision. And counting the 3 years of the tree as uncircumcised. And you're beautiful in Netar Reva'i, which is observing that 4th year as the holy year for the fruit. You're beautiful in circumcision. If you're circumcising your male children and you're bringing them up in the nurture and the admonition of the Lord, you're beautiful. That's Elijah's chair, by the way, at Hebron. You can see it's been used a lot if you look where the feet rest. It says you are beautiful when you say the Shema. You're beautiful when you pray. And she's there, she's got the prayer book. We're there at Tabga, where it's believed that Yeshua asked Peter, do you love me? 3 times. We prayed the most beautiful Shema in that little chapel I think I've ever heard. And this is an old picture I found several years ago. If you'll remember, a terrorist went into a synagogue in Jerusalem and hacked to death several men that were gathered there to pray. And this is a picture of one of the sidurs where it fell. But it's beautiful. You're beautiful in the mezuzah. If you have a mezuzah on your home, the beautiful thing about a mezuzah, it's not like you do a commandment and then you stop. The mezuzah is one that's always being done. If there's a mezuzah on your door, it's ever vigilant. It's a commandment. It's an ongoing commandment. It's always an action for your house, if that makes sense. You're beautiful if you have a mezuzah. It says you are beautiful in tefillin. You are beautiful in the sukkah and with the lulav. That was at Jeremy's house a couple years ago. It says you are beautiful in etrog. You are beautiful when you blow the shofar. You're beautiful in your pilgrimages for the feasts. You are beautiful in repentance at Yom Kippur. You are beautiful in this world, and you are beautiful in the world to come.